Welcome to Conservation Conversations, the podcast where we discuss emerging technologies, global biodiversity trends, and the future of biodiversity conservation. I'm your host, Sean O'Brien, President and CEO of NatureServe, where we leverage science and technology to protect endangered species and ecosystems around the world. This past spring, we kicked off the NatureServe Network Van Tour, or as I like to call it, the Van Humboldt Tour of American Biodiversity, an expedition highlighting how NatureServe works to conserve and sustain biodiversity through the use of technology, collaborative science, and local expertise. I've been journeying across the United States and Canada in my trusty camper van, which I've named the Van Humboldt, in honor of naturalist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt. The Van Humboldt brought me to key ecosystems that support rare and threatened species, and to the Natural Heritage Program scientists who study them. The tour provides a unique opportunity to explore the relationship between people and the natural environment, as well as to connect science with local conservation stories about the future of biodiversity conservation throughout North America. For this special end-of-year episode of Conservation Conversations, we're kicking the Van Humboldt into reverse and hearing from several members of the NatureServe Natural Heritage Network who I met with at stops on the Van Tour. Today's guests will share knowledge about the people and places that we visited and how we can continue to work together to conserve our precious biodiversity. Our first guest is Alabama Natural Heritage Program, Jim Godwin. I had a real blast with Jim in Alabama's Conecuh National Forest, just one stop in the stunning biodiversity of the southeastern United States. Jim, it was great being out there in the field with you and Al Schatz and the rest of the folks from Alabama. It really made me long for my field days myself back when I was doing field work in Costa Rica and Panama, and watching you wade out into the rivers and sort of pull the turtles, the alligator snapping turtles from the humane trap so that we could see them was just amazing. And it reminds me of what you said when we were there about diversity in Alabama, and how some people say it's the Amazon of the United States, but you actually have the position that it's better than the Amazon, shall we say?
Yeah, I think some of the aquatic diversity of Alabama is being promoted as America's Amazon, and yes, I do kind of see that as, I think it kind of takes away from what we really have. That so much of this is focused in the Mobile River Basin, which drains most of Alabama and bits of Georgia and Tennessee. But the Mobile River Basin is globally very important, and in some regards exceeds that of the Amazon. When we look at freshwater turtle diversity, the southeastern United States, and particularly Alabama, is one of the global hotspots, in some measures greater than many of the countries in South America. And then when we extend that to freshwater mussels, again, Alabama and the Mobile River Basin and the southeastern United States, because we're talking about some of the other river systems in here also, Tennessee River System, some of the coastal river systems also. Like the Alabama is the global hotspot for freshwater mussels. But then when we look at crayfish, Alabama has almost 100 species of crayfish, and that is, again, the global hotspot. And so I think, when we're talking about, when we're trying to put labels on these things to attract people's attention, and we use something like America's Amazon, I see this as actually kind of detracting from the overall importance of what we have here, and that we could give it our own label to set it apart if we wanted to.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about 100 species of crayfish, because I think probably most people don't realize there's even 100 species, much less 100 right. in Alabama. Yes. And that was one of the things that I really enjoyed in what you were just saying, is how much pride states take in the diversity within their borders. Mm-hmm. And it's been one of the things that's been a consistent theme on the Van Tour, is the states finding the things that make their state the most biodiverse or the most interesting in terms of biodiversity in one way or another. So I really appreciate you bringing that up here.
But I think what we need to avoid is that it's a competition, because biodiversity is important no matter what it is and where it is and how the numbers fall out.
That is exactly right. And of course, biodiversity doesn't pay any attention to state boundaries.
No, they
That's
don't.
one of the great things about the NatureServe Network, is that we don't pay attention to state boundaries either, in terms of the way we aggregate all of the data, so that we can say, this is happening in Alabama and this is happening in Georgia, and this is important because we can see the sort of cross-border relevancy of things that are happening biologically. And speaking of cross-border biological things, another thing that I saw a lot when I was traveling in the Southeast was the use of prescribed fire, and how important that is for maintaining biodiversity and maintaining especially some of the rare species that we see in these longleaf pine forests. So talk a little bit about that, because I just love the story of fire.
Yeah, so prescribed fire is, and of course with the Heritage Program, we don't actively use fire, but we interact with agencies and other groups that do use prescribed fire as an ecological tool. And it's important for the longleaf pine ecosystem, which has declined dramatically across the southeastern United States. I think the numbers that you see out there is only perhaps 3% of the original longleaf pine ecosystem is still in existence, and and it's a pyrogenic plant community, and so it requires fire. And the way that it's important for one of our projects is that we've been involved with an eastern indigo snake reintroduction project in South Alabama for about 15 years. Our Heritage Program has been in the lead with this, and working with the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources and the U.S. Forest Service. And it's the Forest Service that really implements the fire on the ground. And the use of fire as an ecological tool, it changes the shape of the plant community. And what's important for the indigo snake is that it tends to keep open the tree canopy. It reduces the shrub layer. It encourages this grassy forb and ground layer, and that's important to the gopher tortoise. And so it promotes this, what the gopher tortoise needs as far as ecological requirements for food and openness. And of course, the gopher tortoise constructs these long burrows. Well, the connection with the indigo snake is that the indigo snake as a group is really tropical. And so we've got the eastern indigo snake here, it's kind of the northern limit. And in the winters, the indigo snakes utilize gopher tortoise burrows for refugia, and it concentrates males and females in the winter when they come into contact and then are breeding. And so right now, here it is December, and indigo snakes in South Alabama and Georgia and Florida are actually coming together and breeding, which is unusual for most snake species.
Sure. But also thinking about the gopher tortoise, I remember someone saying that something like 242 species depend on gopher tortoise burrows in one form or another. This is from insects up to the indigo snakes and all sorts of things in terms of their life cycles. And so the fire helps the gopher tortoise, which helps all of these other species, in addition to things that don't depend on the gopher tortoise, like the woodpeckers. And so it's a really amazing story, and it's a really powerful tool that we have in terms of managing ecosystems, not just in these longleaf pine forests, but in forests all across the East.
Right, yes.
My conversation with Jim touched on the immense biodiversity that the Southeast offers, as well as some of the measures people are taking to preserve it. The next two conversations are from our friends in the northeastern United States. I talked to Tim Howard, Director of Science for the New York Natural Heritage Program, about monitoring at-risk species in the High Peaks Wilderness in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. Tim, during our hike up the Brothers, you kept your eyes out for some rare species that you said were in need of documentation. And we ended up coming up across a couple of those species, the purple crowberry and also the black crowberry, and trailing club moths. Of course, these are species that most people haven't even heard of. So I want to know, what's special about them? And also, why do we need to document them?
Yeah, those are really good questions. Well, the purple crowberry is critically imperiled in New York State. It's really rare. We only find it on the high alpine summits, and then from New York, it's it's present in the alpine summits in New Hampshire and Maine as well. And so it's at its really southern part of a range, and it's more common in Canada. And the Lycopodium or Diphasiastrum or ground cedar is also a northern plant that barely makes it into the States, and New York is one of the places where it makes it into. So it's imperiled in New York as well, but more common globally. So we care about these because they're very, very uncommon in New York State, and we're interested in species that are at that position. We want to track them and want to see how they're doing. We had a lead, basically a citizen science report of the purple crowberry on the brothers. And so we really, because it's so uncommon, we really wanted to check up on that and make sure and confirm that it was there and count, and see how much of it was there. The other species, the Lycopodium or Diphasiastrum complanatum, if we want to get the scientific name, was last seen and last documented by us in the 90s, so almost 30 years ago. And so we really wanted to go back and see how it's doing, check up on it.
So this was the first time that anybody had confirmed that species was still in New York State in 30 years?
In this location in New York State. So this was a specific location that we knew about, but we hadn't revisited before. So we have other spots for it in New York State, but this was a spot we hadn't checked up on in a while.
And the crowberry, as you were saying, it's more common further north, but was there something unusual about us finding it where we did, other than it's at the southern end of its range?
Right. So that was an interesting twist in that we hiked up the brothers, and these are sort of shoulders or subsummits to a larger peak. And the place we ended up in was this rounded, rocky knoll with a lot of bare bedrock and patches of trees and patches of stunted trees and vegetation. In our New York community classification, we'd call that a spruce fir rocky summit. And it's a lower elevation than the other places for which we know purple crowberry to occur. And so that was an interesting twist. It's like an outlier, and we wouldn't have expected to find it there. But there it was in all its glory, these big healthy patches. And I wandered around a little more and found, I think, 4 or 5 other patches of the plant in this spruce fir rocky summit community. And that makes it A, a pretty healthy population, and B, sort of interesting and unique outlier that we need to research more. Like, why is purple crowberry at this lower elevation station when we're used to it being at really only the highest, most exposed alpine summits in New York? So that was an interesting find.
That's going to be a fun mystery for you to work on.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So these 2 species are both very small, like they're basically ground cover, and they're along trails that people hike on in the Adirondack Mountains. And the New York Natural Heritage Program works with several community partner organizations like the Adirondack Mountain Club to educate hikers about staying on trails and the importance of that. I'm just sort of thinking about, in this situation, it would be very easy to tread on an imperiled species and do real damage to the biota of New York State. And so what is your advice, and how do you talk to people about, when you're hiking? We want people in nature. We want people experiencing this, but we also want to protect the amazing biodiversity that we have.
Right, exactly. And I mean, all more reason for this, the leave no trace ethic, which is really try to walk on durable surfaces. And durable surfaces means, rock on the rock rather than on the vegetation. No matter what you know about the vegetation, you might think, oh, that's a weed because it's growing on the trail side. But lo and behold, this purple crowberry was creeping out onto the bedrock where you might normally walk. And so those are really good reasons. And you might not notice or understand that some of these species are uncommon or less found. You're exactly right about that collaboration with the Adirondack Mountain Club. They have a fabulous summit steward program where they send interns and summer employees up on the summits to educate and reach out to people to communicate that message. Leave no trace. Please try to walk on the durable surfaces on the bedrock, and that really helps support our biodiversity and our natural systems and our ecosystems.
You know, as a side note to what you're talking about with weeds, when I was in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, two of the imperiled species that we saw were grasses, you know, like a crabgrass and a sedge. And most people see a grass and they're like, okay, it's grass. I can certainly walk on that. But in fact, they can be globally imperiled species and growing right next to the trail, and all the more reason to stay on trail.
Yep, exactly.
After chatting with Tim, I caught up with Greg Podnazinski, head of the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program in the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources there. Greg shared a few interesting tidbits about our site visit to Ohiopile State Park, where riverside habitat and vernal pool communities support a wide diversity of plant and animal species that are monitored by natural heritage scientists and protected by the state of Pennsylvania. In Ohiopile State Park there in Pennsylvania, we went to walked along the river there, which is a popular destination for whitewater rafting. But more importantly, from your perspective and mine, is it's a very important habitat for certain very rare species. And I was like, it's in Pennsylvania, we refer to it as a river scour, which is a term that I wasn't familiar with before. But so can you explain what it means for it to be a scour and how that's
Sure. The river scours refer to zones that are subject to periodic flooding events. And during those events, periods of high flow, some of it depends on the time of the year, what kind of events are happening. So where we went, where it was bare rock, particularly in winter, they're potentially exposed to a lot of ice moving. And so it's that ice moving across the surface of that exposed bedrock that really kind of scours off and prevents any soil development if there's any chance of sedimentation occurring. So those high flows remove all that. So it's an environment that for plants to survive, they're often limited to the cracks and crevices in that environment, which makes it a fairly specialized habitat.
Right, and we saw some of those plants. And also, now that I heard the term and had it explained, you see river scour in a lot of places. I see it along the Potomac River and everywhere.
Sure.
But it does mean you get some really interesting species because they have to be sort of tenacious to make it in that habitat. So one of the species we saw was beautiful Barbara's buttons. And that's a species that you all described based on samples from that location. Is that correct?
Well, I have to give the credit to Wes Snap and a few other folks down at UNC. It's the story is relayed to me is that actually Wes was ran across these while looking in an herbarium down in North Carolina and ran across a Marshallia grandifolia specimen from North Carolina. And of course, he has done work in West Virginia and in Pennsylvania. And he said, wait a minute, this doesn't look like Marshallia grandifolia. It doesn't look right. And so he did more investigative work and found out that the specimens that we had up here were different species. And so our contribution to all this is that Wes then said, okay, we need new type specimens because you guys have something different. So we collected 6 Marshallia pulchra, as opposed to grandiflora, from the Ohiopile State Park, from the scour there, and sent that off to Wes, and those became the 6 new holotypes for Marshallia pulchra.
I think that's so exciting. And it also is one of the things that's cool because it shows the power of the network, because you're able to have this kind of communication and share the information. It contributes to everybody's knowledge. It's great. So one of the things that was fun on the trip is we also went to look at these vernal pools, which is another habitat type that was right close by in Ohiopile there, and is also a little bit unusual, and of course allows for many unusual species. So tell us a little bit about vernal pools and what was special there.
So what they were looking for is a place to create a vernal pool, something that has that sort of ephemeral hydrology, that is wet in the springtime very often in the east, dries out by mid-late summer, and that characteristic alone helps limit the colonization by fish, and makes it a safer habitat for amphibians and some of these vernal pool inverts. So at that particular site, in terms of the vernal pool, there is an old fishing pond there that was spring fed, and they had diverted a nearby creek to go into it. But it was like had been abandoned. It was like a 9-foot deep concrete structure, which of limited value to the vernal pool critters.
Right.
They try to use it, but it's kind of tough with a 9-foot wall.
Yeah, and
So
concrete bottom.
and a concrete bottom. So they got some funding and state parks threw some resources at it. And so working with some of our heritage staff, worked out a design, and they broke up that concrete pond, buried a lot of it underneath it, but recontoured the site and created a new vernal pool habitat there. So we went to see it a year after they had done it, and already you saw there's a lot of vegetation in there, a little bit overrun by newts, but they're hoping that will change over time and get a little bit other stuff in there.
Everybody loves newts.
Everybody loves newts, but there is a limit. So we're going to be monitoring that site and working with the park, and hopefully from year to year it'll get better, and if we need to, we'll do some adjustments. But that site's already been known to have like a rare dragonfly utilizing it. So yeah, it's
one of the things I thought was interesting there was it's a restoration story, and it shows the importance of managing for endangered species and endangered habitat. And you just can't put a fence around it, right, and assume everything's going to be fine. If you really want to have and attract and make habitat for rare and endangered species, you need to actively work on that and understand the biology of them so that you can do that. And you guys did a beautiful job of that in that location. My conversations with both Tim and Greg highlighted the importance of scientists taking time to observe species in the field and using the data collected on these species to properly describe them. Up next, I chat with Patrick Henry, Executive Director of NatureServe Canada, about how scientific data is collected and shared between network programs in the United States and Canada to promote biodiversity conservation most effectively in both countries. So the NatureServe Network includes, of course, all of the United States as well as Canada and the provinces and territories and federal areas there. And so I wanted to talk, Patrick, about why it's important that we have the United States and Canada sort of in the same network, and what's important about the partnership that you have as an organization, NatureServe Canada, with your federal government in Canada.
Yeah, so thanks, Sean. Yeah, ultimately, I mean, in terms of the NatureServe Network and the focus of having the Canadian and United States representation there, I mean, that's super critical in terms of ensuring that all the work that, provincial, territorial, state governments do can actually be rolled up into have a bigger impact, across borders and so on. So that's very clear. In terms of the Canadian context, certainly NatureServe Canada's provincial and territorial CDCs are a key part of the network, and like you said, we also have our federal partners as well. Just a little bit of background on that. I mean, we've had CDCs. The first established, I think, was Quebec in 1988, and Nunavut CDC established in 2016. So we've now got all Canadian provinces and territories represented by a conservation data center. Heritage Program is the term in the United States. And NatureServe Canada was set up as a charitable organization in 1999. So we were, Association for Biodiversity Information, like NatureServe, previous to that. And through this whole process, we're brought together, like I said, the provincial territorial CDCs and the 3 responsible federal departments into our membership. And those are Environment and Climate Change Canada, Parks Canada Agency, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So, I mean, what's critical to recognize there is that our membership has all of the provincial, territorial, and federal agencies related to the Canadian Federal Species at Risk Act. And that's really what drives a lot of the work of NatureServe Canada. So, for example, the provincial territorial CDC information is required for key activities under COSEWIC, for example, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada.
Which is what we would think of as our Endangered Species Act down here.
Yes, exactly. And COSI-WIC status assessments ultimately feed into listings under the Canadian Federal Species at Risk Act. And so there are a whole slew of provincial, territorial, national, and federal biodiversity and species at risk programs that we all collectively are working on together. And so the point is, we could all be working in silos, but through NatureServe Canada, bringing everybody to the table, there's a sort of a much more fluid and regular communication on key topics and shared objectives, and then of course also sharing resources and so on.
Right. So on the Van Tour, I visited Ontario and Quebec, and you came over to go on those two field site visits, which was awesome. And we went to Burnt Lands Provincial Park in Ontario, and then we went over in Quebec to look at some species that are sort of threatened and need to be tracked and managed, and talked a lot about how climate change and other things are affecting the species in Canada. But I'm sort of interested in sort of this big picture, right? So it's easy for people to sort of get focused on their local area, but species don't pay any attention to provincial boundaries.
In terms of having that sort of bigger picture impact, right? Because we've got the provincial and territorial conservation data centers who are developing their information. NatureServe Canada works with NatureServe to roll up that information into national and global information so that we can have an impact beyond that sort of subnational level, right? Roll up information, understand what's happening national level, understand global, and be able to have conversations and programs to manage and improve the state of biodiversity. A key objective for us is to get the NatureServe Canada data out to those who need it, and to not have any obstacles in terms of cost or the type of data they can receive through the platform. And this ultimately will benefit conservation, but it's also very useful for our conservation data centers and for NatureServe Canada in terms of the amount of work effort that we put into managing data requests currently. So that's a win-win that we're excited to see the rollout of NatureServe Explorer Pro in January 6, 2022. I also just mentioned some other programs that we work with through our membership. For example, the General Status Program. So this is a national program with the provinces, territories, and federal government, and it's all NatureServe Canada members and a few others. The program uses the NatureServe methodology. So in 2013, this national program adopted NatureServe methodology to do the assessment and understand the distribution of all of Canada's wild species. So not just rare and threatened species. The wild species report that's about to be released, the 2020 report, it'll come out in early 2022. It is going to cover 46,000 species from 47 taxonomic groups. So you can see there's an immense effort that to understand Canada's biodiversity. And so ultimately, it takes all of the information from all of our members, from other partners and members of the National General Status Working Group and experts to work together to bring this type of information. And that's something that NatureServe Canada is, certainly very happy to be playing a role in bringing together expertise, data, and contributing to that project.
Having access to this information wall to wall across all of Canada through an online portal that allows them to get the information and use it in decision making is just so important. And it's so great that the conservation data centers are so well coordinated by you and by NatureServe Canada to provide that information. Thank you for listening to today's special Network Van Tour episode of Conservation Conversations. I enjoyed introducing you to just a few of the people who participated in site visits along the tour by sharing their knowledge about biodiversity conservation across North America. I wish you were out in the field with me and all these amazing ologists, as we call them, the biologists, ecologists, zoologists, and of course botanists, which does not end in ology, but that's okay, to see firsthand the amazing biodiversity right here at home. The Van Humboldt still has a lot more natural heritage to explore, and I invite you to join the ride by checking out natureserve.org/Van Tour and following NatureServe on social media. We look forward to future stops along the tour after the new year, when I'll be visiting network programs throughout the Western and Midwestern United States, as well as several parts of Canada. And finally, as we wrap up our final podcast of the year, I'd like to take a moment to share how you too can join the effort to conserve our natural heritage. There are several ways to donate to NatureServe's mission to conserve biodiversity, including by adopting a species. Adopt a plant or an animal of your choice through our Adopt a Species program. I invite you to visit natureserve.org/adopt to learn more. Thank you, and on behalf of everyone at NatureServe and all of our network partners, Happy New Year.